Daniel says in verse 19, I desire to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast. So it's no wonder that the fourth beast is not named directly in many prophetic charts. Like Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece are named by name. And in fact, even those first three beasts are even identified directly in the book of Daniel, right? Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece are all even identified in the book of Daniel, but yet the fourth beast doesn't have a name. And I believe that owes to the fact of this near-far prophecy. Again, preterism is kind of the near aspect where it describes Rome's come to power, rise to power, and dominance over the land of Israel, the people of Israel, the temple of Israel, and that aspect about Rome in the first century. And yet at the same time, the futurist view lends us the other aspect of the far part of Daniel's prophecy that pertains to the book of Revelation, I believe, and pertains to what will be in still yet future from our day here in 2023. Daniel says, I want to know the exact meaning of this fourth beast. Why is it different from all the others? Why is it dreadful? So he replays some of the verbiage from his vision. And he talks about the meaning of the 10 horns in verse 20 that were on his head and the other horns which came up. Remember, these 10 horns directly plug in to the 10 horns in the book of Revelation as well. And so he also zeroes in on this little horn and the 3 horns and the one that had eyes like a mouth uttering great boasts. It was larger in appearance than its associates. Verse 20. Daniel says, he gives us some more details. He kept looking and the horn was waging war. It's like he asks for the interpretation and then he turns around and starts looking at the vision again in verse 21. And this horn was waging war with the saints, literally Hebrew says the holy ones, was waging war with the saints, or the Aramaic, and prevailing against them. Now, this part of the vision should really concern us, especially if you count yourself among the holy ones. From the first century perspective, it was future to Daniel, but from the first century perspective, which is now past history to us, the Antichrist figure known as Antiochus Epiphanes, he waged war against the people of Jerusalem in those days, the people of Israel in those days. He waged war with a lot of peoples around him, not just Jerusalem, but he caused a lot of trouble for the Israelites, for the Jews, for the temple, for defiling it. The story of Maccabees all over again. Rome itself persecuted the saints, right, in their day. I mean, read Fox's Book of Martyrs, and you'll get the idea that Christianity eventually came under the persecution of big bad Rome, right, big brother Rome, killing Christians everywhere they went. And so this persecution against the saints is understandable, but notice that Daniel says he was making war with the saints and prevailing against them. If we consider that parts of this prophecy have not yet been fully fulfilled, especially when we get to parts of Yeshua's prophecy in the book of Matthew, Paul's prophecy in his letters to the Thessalonian churches, and then John's prophecy in the book of Revelation, we're going to find that this Antichrist who's going to come on the scene is going to do just like his predecessors, his type, his shadow, which was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's going to wage war against the saints, and God's going to allow him to prevail against them as well. Now, we're going to read about more of this persecution in chapter 9 and chapter 10, 11, and 12 of Daniel, and we'll get to that probably next week. But germane to our study here is that this persecution takes place until, verse 22 says, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed. So it seems like there's this succession of events that is immediately connected to one another. There's the persecution and war against the saints that this little horn is engaged in until it's interrupted by the Ancient of Days, which is God, the Father, coming, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints, right, the ones who were being persecuted, of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. And this is good news. This is good news. What this tells us is that, again, in near-far fashion, Daniel is foreseeing that on the one hand, on the near landscape, the closer mountain peak in our little picture that will flash on the screen of prophetic telescoping, the first mountain peak would probably correspond to 1st century, 70 AD, persecution of the people of Israel and Jerusalem being sacked, the temple being destroyed, moving into Christians being persecuted, right? So we're talking about when we say the saints or the people of God, on the one hand, on the natural level, we're talking about Israel. But on the spiritual level, we're talking about Christians. Both peoples are in view in the prophetic visions when we talk about saints being persecuted. So just don't think, well, hey, how can the saints be the Jews? They don't believe in Jesus. No, in the Old Testament, the word saints, the holy ones here, is a reference to those within the righteous natural line of physical Israel, those who have a genuine relationship with God, and even those whom the Antichrist deems are just in covenant with God on the whole, right? Doesn't matter whether they're even really particularly righteous, but they have some amount of covenant loyalty, right? They keep the covenant. Remember, you have to when you read through the story of the Maccabees, Antiochus Epiphanes sought to put an end to Torah observance on anyone who would practice it, right? He made it illegal to study and practice Torah. He made circumcision illegal. He didn't care whether you were really a faithful follower of God. He just cared whether or not you were of Jewish persuasion and practice a semblance of Torah obedience, right? If it looked like Torah obedience to him, then you were under his persecution. You were on his radar, and you were going to get persecuted. So it should be at the end of days when the Antichrist hits the scene, and we read in the book of Revelation that he's going to make war with the offspring of the woman in chapter 12 of Revelation. He's going to go off to make war, the devil, Antichrist, the devil incarnate. Antichrist will go off to make war with the offspring of Jacob, the offspring of Israel, and those who have the testimony of Jesus. So this puts Jews and Christians in the same boat, the people of the book. I also imagine that the Antichrist is going to probably make war with Muslims as well, because of their fierce monotheistic belief in one God and their devotion to Allah and to Muhammad and anything that's religious. I believe they will probably fall under a measured amount of persecution for the Antichrist as well. So, in other words, all of what we might call the monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic faiths, or the people of the book, this would include Jews, Christians, and Muslims, are probably all going to be under the persecution of Antichrist. And this is prefigured by Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2 centuries before the first century. Of course, there weren't any Muslims around for him to persecute then, and there weren't any Christians per se either, so his attention was just focused on the Jewish people. But notice in verse 21 and going into 22, the persecution is directly interrupted, as it were, in the text by the Ancient of Days setting up the kingdom. This would seem to suggest that in the first century, all of this wasn't completely fulfilled, although the kingdom was brought in its spiritual sense in the first century. Yeshua ushered in the kingdom and inaugurated it and brought it to a place where it was recognizable within the hearts of men. So the spiritual kingdom was breaking into the present day of Yeshua's first century crowd, so much so that he could describe the kingdom of heaven being among them. It's in your midst. And yet at the same time, this near and not yet, or now and not yet, near and far aspect of prophecy, right? The prophetic telescoping of the two mountain peaks suggests that there's a part of God's kingdom that's still future. And so the preterists, who are full-blown hyper-preterists, who believe that everything's fulfilled and that the kingdom was already ushered in, and that the saints have taken possession of the kingdom, and that Yeshua is here, there's no more second coming, there's no more resurrection or rapture, everything's already took place in the first century. I think they have serious problems with their hermeneutic principle of trying to interpret all of that and smash it into the first century. At least partial preterism gives some credit to the fact that some of this must still be future. And so I'm going to go with a more of a futurist perspective and recognize that a lot of this is still future. So going back to this fourth beast, in the middle of the vision, where Daniel's contemplating this fourth beast, he sees this interruption of the kingdom, and the interpreter tells him about the kingdom, but then the interpreter tells him this is what the fourth beast will be. Starting in verse 23. It's a fourth kingdom on the earth. Now, the word fourth there suggests the succession from 1, 2, 3, and then 4 without any gap. And so, again, I'll keep going back to this near/far or now/not yet aspect or prophetic telescoping, where on the one hand, if we look at the statue of Nebuchadnezzar and overlay it and correspond it with the four beasts of Daniel, then the kingdoms arrive on the scene on planet Earth, and they come and go in successive fashion, one right after the other without any gaps. Babylon moves into Medo-Persia, which moves into Greece, which moves right into Rome. That is the historical succession of the kingdoms. Likewise, Daniel sees four beasts. He doesn't see 1, 2, 3, ... and then 4. He sees 1, 2, 3, 4, which suggests that they are all four beasts successive, one after the other, which really gives a strong indicator that Rome is the fourth beast on the near aspect, on the historical scope, near to Daniel from his perspective, right within a few hundred years, but past history to us, almost 2,000 years since we've been talking about first century Rome and its power to crush the Messiah, send him to the cross, crucify him, persecute the saints and things like that in the first century. So we're talking about ancient history in that respect, fourth beast. However, please don't lose sight of the fact that the prophecy here on the fourth beast has a profound near-far aspect, or a now not yet aspect. The fourth beast is a type and shadow of both Rome as well as a revived Rome, or a Rome and a new world order that's still future. So what is in between the historical Rome and the revived Rome, or what is in between the near aspect of Rome and the far aspect of Rome? What church historians call the church age, or what we might recognize is this gap, almost 2,000 years long. We know from hindsight that the gap must exist. Even if Daniel didn't see the gap, which he apparently didn't, at least he doesn't describe it, which is fine, because the gap, aka the church age, aka the times of the Gentiles in its fullness, all of that was part of the mystery of God that was hidden from the writers of the Old Testament, including Daniel. So it makes sense that Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 9, they don't see the gap. They just see 1, 2, 3, 4 when it comes to kingdoms and beasts, etc., etc. They don't see that the fourth is actually a type and shadow of both the fourth and the eighth, right? Remember, John tells us there are 7. When we look at the beast, which has 10 heads and 7 horns, which correspond to the 7 nations of kingdoms that Satan has utilized to persecute Israel down through the ages, going all the way back to Egypt as number 1, Assyria as number 2, Babylon as 3, Medo-Persia as 4, Greece as 5, Rome as 6, and then the 7th one is unnamed by Daniel because it exists in the gap. Make sure I understand what I'm saying. And why would there be a gap? Because Israel is out of the land and her temple's destroyed. So it's a time of exile. It's a time of diaspora. It's a time where the historical scene is primarily given over to the Gentiles, times of the Gentiles. That historical gap that was a mystery to the Old Testament saints. So that's why the 7th beast is particularly unnamed and even hardly even given any biblical attention at all, but he does show up in the book of Revelation, but he does not show up in the book of Daniel, is the point I'm trying to make. There's no mention. If you do a search for Daniel chapter 2, plug in the word 7 there, it doesn't show up in Daniel chapter 2. There's no mention of the word 7, no 7 horns, no 7 beasts, no 7 eyes, no 7 anything. Likewise, in Daniel chapter 10, there's no 7 anything. There are 10, right? There are 10 toes in Daniel's Nebuchadnezzar statue, and there are 10 horns in Daniel's fourth beast, but there's no 7 mentioned. So the 7th beast does show up in Revelation, but very, very, very briefly. And then this final 8th beast is the one that gets most of the attention. And the 8th beast, who directly corresponds to the 10 horns and the 10 kings, he is the type of the fourth beast. So the relationship I'm trying to say in closing in my study tonight, there's a direct relationship between the fourth beast and the 8th beast. That's the point I'm trying to make. The 8th beast of Revelation, which again, Daniel sees the 8th beast as more or less part of the fourth. And so from Daniel's perspective, there's kind of this just one beast called the fourth, but really it's a composite beast that's a type and shadow of both the fourth beast, which is Rome, and then the 8th beast, which is kind of a revived Rome or something to that effect. So in closing, for this particular part of my study. Let me just reference this particular chart, and we'll close with this chart. And next week, we'll be poised to directly turn to Daniel chapter 9, start looking at Daniel's 70 weeks. And we'll see more of these beasts and kingdoms again, but I don't want to belabor this point. In this particular chart, looking at this column on the far left, we've got a heading called Kingdom. We've got Babylon, which corresponds, if we move over to start moving right, Babylon corresponds to the head of gold, which corresponds to the lion with eagle's wings in chapter 7. So the kingdom of Babylon is the head of gold in chapter 2, who is also the lion in chapter 7. This is, we're drawing our study to a close. This is the conclusion, the summary. In Daniel chapter 2, the kingdom of Medo-Persia is in the statue is the chest and arms of silver, and is also the bear with 3 ribs in Daniel chapter 7. So Medo-Persia is the silver and is also the bear. Moving down, the third kingdom of Greece in the statue is the belly and thighs of bronze of chapter 2. So the kingdom is Greece, right? The belly and thighs of bronze in chapter 2. And then this corresponds with the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, which makes sense, right? A leopard moves swiftly. Alexander the Great conquered the known world very, very quickly, right? And as a young man. And when we talk about 4 wings, I mean, it's like he never even touched the ground, right? He just swiftly moved back and forth and just conquered everything. And then we talk about 4 heads, 4 wings, 4 generals that inherited his kingdom when he died. All right, that all makes sense. And then the 4th kingdom in the chart here is Rome, which corresponds in the statue to the legs of iron of chapter 2, which corresponds to the unique, dreadful, and terrible beast, or the 4th beast, in Daniel chapter 7. And when we keep looking further into this chart, when we're talking about kingdoms, just below Rome, we've got Rome divided and dispersed as we start looking at the feet and the toes. That's another kingdom, but yet it's part of Rome. It's a continuation of Rome. Is it East and West Rome? Yes. Is it Istanbul who picked up where Rome left off? Yes. Things like that we could talk about. But notice that in the statue, it's represented by the feet, partly of iron and partly of clay. And yet then in Daniel's beasts, it's represented by the 10 horns and a little horn. So we're going to see how this corresponds to Revelation eventually. Like I said, I kind of give you a sneak peek of it tonight. And then finally, and most importantly, really, if we honestly consider it, the most important kingdom in the Daniel 2 vision and the Daniel 7 vision, and the most important kingdom in the book of Revelation as well, is the final millennial kingdom that will come on planet Earth. And this kingdom in Daniel's statue, in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, is represented by the stone cut without hands, which strikes the image and fills the entire earth. Yet in Daniel's vision in chapter 7, it's represented by the Ancient of Days giving this kingdom to the Son of Man, along with the saints of the Most High who inherit this kingdom that Daniel describes in Daniel chapter 7. And this corresponds directly with the book of John telling us about the New Jerusalem. I'm sorry, not the New Jerusalem, the millennial kingdom, which leads into the New Jerusalem. But first, it's that millennial reign with Messiah, where the saints inherit the kingdom along with King Messiah. And so that's going to do it for our look at Daniel's chapter 2 and 7. Next week, as we look at my schedule here, we'll turn to topic 5 and begin to peel back some of the details of Daniel's 70 weeks, or the 70 weeks of Daniel. And we kind of gave you a little sneak preview of this several weeks back, where we looked at this prophecy in Daniel 9, 24 through 27. But we're going to directly turn towards that and get some more details. It's not going to be a deep dive again. I don't mean to disappoint you, but it will talk about details that will give us a better appreciation of the further prophecies that we're going to be reading about. For instance, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Mark 11, Luke 13, Luke 17, Luke 21, I believe. First and Second Thessalonians, and of course, the book of Revelation and things like that. So we'll look at that then. But that'll do it now for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.